The town of Greyhaven had always been shrouded in whispers. Tucked deep in the woods, its quiet streets held a peculiar charm during the day, but after dark, unease crept through the air like an unseen fog. The town's biggest mystery was the looming, dilapidated house at the end of Sycamore Lane. No one knew much about the occupant, Arthur Kane. Arthur was a quiet man, his pale face and hollow eyes often hidden beneath the brim of a worn hat. He would wander into town once a week, purchasing peculiar items from the hardware store, knives, tarps, bleach, always paid for in cash. His monotone thank you was the most anyone heard from him. It wasn't Arthur's odd shopping habits or his isolation that unnerved the townsfolk. It was the rumors. Stories whispered among neighbors late at night about pets vanishing near his property, of strange noises echoing through the forest, and of the foul, metallic stench that occasionally wafted from his land. Yet, no one dared to confront him. He was just peculiar enough to be terrifying. When Anna moved to Greyhaven, she saw none of the fear that gripped the townsfolk. A city transplant, she found the local superstitions charming. Arthur, in her mind, was a lonely, misunderstood man. Against everyone's advice, she made it her mission to befriend him. Her first visit to the house was met with silence. She knocked 3 times on the door, her heartbeat quickening. Just as she was about to leave, the door creaked open. Arthur stood there, his sunken eyes studying her. She offered him cookies, her words tumbling nervously, but he only stared. Finally, he muttered, "Come back tomorrow." The next day and the day after that, Anna returned. Each time, Arthur allowed her a little further into his world. The house was pristine, almost unnervingly so. The floors gleamed, and the air smelled of disinfectant. She asked him about his life, and though his answers were brief, he seemed to appreciate the company. It was on her 5th visit that Arthur invited her into the basement. She hesitated, but her curiosity outweighed her caution. The steps creaked underfoot, and the cool air smelled faintly of damp earth. At the bottom, she froze. The basement was meticulously arranged, walls lined with knives, saws, and hooks, all gleaming under a fluorescent light. A large steel table stood in the center, its surface clean yet scratched from years of use. Her gaze flickered to a corner where mannequins, and at least that's what she thought at first, stood, eerily lifelike. "Do you like it?" Arthur's voice was soft but carried a chilling weight. Anna's stomach churned as she noticed the mannequins' hands, their fingernails cracked and dirt-stained. She realized they weren't mannequins at all. She turned to run, but Arthur was faster. He grabbed her wrist with a strength that betrayed his frail appearance. "You wanted to know me," he whispered, his breath hot against her ear. "Now you will." Anna was never seen again. Weeks passed, and Arthur's visits to town continued as usual. If the townsfolk noticed the new bracelet he wore, a simple leather strap with a charm that looked eerily like a human tooth, they didn't dare comment. The whispers in Greyhaven grew louder. Strange noises came from Arthur's house at night. Muffled screams and the hum of power tools. But, as always, fear kept everyone at bay. No one wanted to become the next addition to Arthur Kane's collection. And so, the house at the end of Sycamore Lane remained, its secrets hidden in the shadows, waiting for the next curious soul who couldn't resist the call of the unknowable.
Story number 2.
On the outskirts of the small town of Dunning, nestled within a forest that locals refused to enter after dusk, stood the Harper House. It was a towering, Gothic structure with spires that seemed to claw at the sky, windows that always seemed dark and empty, and a wrought iron gate that screeched like a dying animal whenever the wind blew. Nobody had lived there for decades, not since the Harper family vanished in the middle of a snowy winter night, leaving behind a dinner table set for 5 and a single plate of untouched, rotting food. The house had become a local legend, a place of dares and whispered horror stories. But no one dared to linger there for long, not after the stories of screams echoing from its walls on the coldest nights, or the sight of lights flickering in the windows despite no one living inside. When Elliot, an urban explorer with a growing YouTube channel, announced his intention to spend a night inside Harper House, the townsfolk warned him against it. He laughed off their concerns, dismissing them as small-town superstition. Armed with a flashlight, a camera, and a backpack of supplies, he set out just before sunset, his excitement palpable as he filmed his entrance through the rusty gates. The first hour passed uneventfully. Elliot explored the dusty halls, the peeling wallpaper, and the rotting furniture. He narrated for his audience, mocking the supposed hauntings, as he pointed out how the house groaned in the wind and how the creaks of the floorboards were nothing more than age. But as the night wore on, something changed. The temperature dropped sharply, his breath fogging in the air despite the lack of wind. His flashlight flickered, the beam narrowing as if the darkness were swallowing the light. And then he heard it, the faint sound of footsteps echoing above him. Probably a raccoon, Elliot muttered to the camera, his voice less confident now. He climbed the grand staircase, the flashlight trembling in his grip. Each step creaked louder than the last, the sound reverberating through the house like a warning. At the top, the footsteps stopped. Elliot shone his light down the hallway, the beam catching the edge of an open door. Slowly, he approached, his pulse pounding in his ears. Inside the room was a crib. Its wood was splintered and warped with age, and something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong in this world. Hanging above the crib was a mobile, its ornaments made of what looked like bone, spinning lazily despite the air being still. A faint cry echoed from the crib, the sound of a baby's wail. Elliot froze, every hair on his body standing on end. The crib was empty, and then the mobile stopped spinning. Behind him, the door slammed shut with such force it rattled the walls. He spun, fumbling for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. His flashlight went out, plunging the room into darkness. Elliot. The voice was a whisper, a childlike lilt that crawled into his ears and burrowed into his brain. He whipped around, the camera still recording, capturing the faint outline of a figure standing by the crib. It was small, no taller than a child, but its proportions were wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. The figure stepped closer, and the air filled with the sickly sweet smell of decay. Elliot screamed, pounding on the door as the figure approached. The camera captured his final moments. The door bursting open, the sound of his desperate footsteps pounding down the stairs, and then the camera being dropped. Forgotten. When the townsfolk found the camera a week later, it was sitting in the center of the Harper house's dining table. It played the footage of Elliot's escape, but the recording didn't end with his retreat. Instead, it showed the dining room slowly filling with shadowy figures, their hollow eyes staring into the lens. At the head of the table sat the childlike figure, its mouth opening in a wide, inhuman grin as it whispered, "Stay. With us." Elliot was never seen again.
Story number 3.
The town of Black Hollow had a peculiar tradition. Every 5 years, at the stroke of midnight on December 7th, the residents gathered in the town square and lit a massive bonfire. No one ever spoke about why they did it. No one dared to skip it. Outsiders found it quaint, even charming, but they didn't know the truth, didn't hear the stories passed down for generations. Ava had moved to Black Hollow 3 weeks ago. A journalist by trade, she loved uncovering hidden histories, peeling back layers of superstition to find the truth. The townsfolk were tight-lipped about the bonfire, their faces darkening whenever she pressed them for details. So, she decided to investigate on her own. That night, as the town gathered in the square, Ava slipped away and made her way to the woods. Her flashlight barely penetrated the thick fog, and every step felt like a violation, as if the forest itself didn't want her there. She was determined to uncover whatever the town was hiding. The deeper she went, the colder it became. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying a strange, low hum that didn't sound natural. It was rhythmic, almost like chanting, but distorted, as if coming from far away and too close all at once. Ava gripped her flashlight tighter. She stumbled upon a clearing, her breath hitching in her throat. At the center was an ancient stone altar, its surface blackened with scorch marks and stained with something darker. Surrounding it were crude carvings etched into the ground, symbols she didn't recognize, yet they made her stomach churn. She crouched to take a picture, the flash illuminating the surrounding woods for a split second. When the light faded, she froze. Someone or something was standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, impossibly so, with elongated limbs that seemed to stretch into the shadows. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a featureless void, like a hole cut into reality. It moved toward her with a jerking, unnatural gait, as though it didn't belong in this world. Ava stumbled back, dropping her flashlight. In the sudden darkness, she could hear it moving closer, its footsteps crunching on the frozen ground. Then the chanting grew louder. It was all around her now, a cacophony of whispers and guttural moans. She covered her ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside her head, gnawing at her sanity. She bolted, blindly running through the woods. Branches clawed at her face and arms, but she didn't stop. The chanting followed her, growing louder, more insistent. And then she saw it, a faint glow in the distance, the bonfire. Bursting out of the woods, Ava collapsed near the edge of the square. The townsfolk turned to her, their faces a mix of horror and resignation. Before she could speak, the mayor knelt beside her and, gripping her shoulders with surprising strength, "You weren't supposed to go there," he hissed, his voice trembling. "It's seen you now." "What is it?" Ava choked out, tears streaming down her face. The mayor looked over her shoulder, his face pale. "Run," he whispered. She turned, and there it was, standing at the edge of the woods. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. The bonfire roared to life, the flames twisting unnaturally, casting monstrous shadows across the square. The chanting returned, louder and more frenzied. The townsfolk formed a circle around the fire, their faces blank, their voices joining the unholy chorus. The air grew heavy, and Ava fell to her knees, unable to breathe. The figure stepped closer, its void-like face inches from hers. "You should have stayed away," it whispered, though its featureless form had no mouth. The last thing Ava saw was the flames of the bonfire reflected in the void. When morning came, the town square was empty. The bonfire was reduced to ash, and Ava was gone. Her car remained parked in front of her rented house, her belongings untouched. The townsfolk didn't speak of her again. 5 years later, at the next bonfire, someone claimed to hear a woman's scream echo from the woods. But they all knew better than to look.
Story number 4.
The road through Hollow Creek was one no one took after sunset. Locals claimed it was cursed, a stretch of asphalt that seemed to stretch endlessly if you dared drive it after dark. Many dismissed the stories as rural folklore, but those who tried to test the legend often disappeared, leaving only their abandoned vehicles on the roadside, doors ajar, and headlights still on. Alex was a skeptic, a self-proclaimed debunker of supernatural myths. When his friend Sam dared him to drive through Hollow Creek at night, Alex didn't hesitate. Armed with a full tank of gas, a camera, and a playlist of eerie music for dramatic effect, he set off just before dusk. The road was unremarkable at first, just a narrow, winding path flanked by dense trees. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the sky turned from orange to deep blue. As darkness settled, Alex noticed how still everything had become. The hum of crickets, the distant croak of frogs, even the rustle of leaves, gone. The silence was suffocating. The first strange thing happened about 20 minutes in. His headlights caught a figure standing at the edge of the road. It was a woman, her long black hair hanging in her face, her pale dress tattered and stained. Alex slowed down, rolling his window down slightly. "Are you okay?" he called out. The woman didn't move. She just stood there, her head tilted ever so slightly, as if she were listening. Unnerved, Alex decided to keep driving. In his rearview mirror, the woman was gone. He chalked it up to his imagination and pressed on, but the road didn't seem to end. The trees stretched endlessly in both directions, and the asphalt ahead twisted in impossible loops. His GPS was no help. It showed him in the middle of a blank void. The next time he saw the woman, she was standing in the middle of the road. Alex slammed on the brakes, his car screeching to a halt mere feet from her. This time, she moved. Slowly, unnaturally, she lifted her head. Her face was wrong. Too wide, too flat. Her eyes were black pits, and her mouth stretched impossibly wide into a grin that sent icy tendrils of fear down Alex's spine. He reversed, tires squealing, but no matter how far back he went, the woman remained in his headlights, always the same distance away. Her head tilted further, almost upside down now, her grin widening. She began to move toward him, not walking but gliding, her feet hovering inches above the ground. Panicking, Alex threw the car into drive and floored it. The woman vanished as he sped forward, his heart pounding. But the road had changed. It wasn't just a stretch of asphalt anymore. It was twisted, unnatural. The trees leaned inward, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. The air grew thick, heavy, each breath a struggle. The radio flickered on, static hissing through the speakers. Amid the noise, a voice broke through, soft and raspy. "You shouldn't be here." Alex tried to turn the radio off, but the knob wouldn't budge. The voice continued, growing louder. "Turn back. It's already watching." The headlights flickered, and for a brief, terrifying moment, they went out completely. When they came back on, the woman was sitting in the passenger seat, her black eyes locked on his. Alex screamed, jerking the wheel. The car skidded, crashing into a tree. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was the woman crawling across the shattered windshield, her grin filling his vision. When Alex woke up, he was back on the road, sitting in his car. The engine was off, and the forest was silent. His phone was dead, and the clock on the dashboard blinked 12 over and over again. He stumbled out of the car, his legs shaking, and began to walk. The road stretched endlessly ahead of him, just no matter how far he went. Behind him, he could hear the faint hum of an engine. He turned, but no cars were there, just the sound growing louder, accompanied by a distant, haunting laugh. When search parties found Alex's car a week later, it was empty. The doors were locked, and the keys were still in the ignition. On the seat was his camera, which contained only one recording, a single, flickering frame of a woman's grinning face. Alex was never seen again. Hollow Creek Road remained as silent as ever, waiting for its next traveler.
Story number 5.
There's a gas station just off Highway 16, the kind of place you stop at only if you're desperate. Its neon sign buzzes faintly. Half the letters burned out, and the pumps look like they haven't been upgraded since the 70s. The cashier, an old man with weathered skin and tired eyes, barely glances at customers. But if you're unlucky enough to arrive after midnight, you'll notice something strange. The third pump. It doesn't match the others. It's newer, gleaming unnaturally under the flickering light. The pump is always labeled out of service, but every once in a while, someone ignores the sign. Locals know better. Sam was just passing through town, trying to make it to the next city before dawn. His fuel gauge was flirting with empty, and when he saw the gas station, he decided to take his chances. The place was deserted, the surrounding woods swallowing the night in an oppressive silence. The regular pumps were taped off, out of order. Sam swore under his breath. Then he saw the third pump, its handle hanging neatly, the out-of-service sign flapping in the breeze. He hesitated, glancing at the station's dark windows, but his desperation won. He pulled up and grabbed the handle. As he began to pump, the air around him shifted. The temperature plummeted, his breath fogging in the cold. The forest seemed to draw closer, the trees leaning unnaturally, their branches clawing toward the station. Sam tried to shrug off the unease, focusing on the rhythmic click of the pump. Then he heard it, a faint scratching sound, like nails dragging against metal. He looked down, expecting to see the pump malfunctioning, but instead he saw something that made his blood run cold. The fuel wasn't gasoline. It was thick, black, and oily, oozing out in slow, viscous globs. The smell wasn't the sharp tang of fuel, but something sickly sweet, like rotting fruit. He dropped the handle, stumbling back. The scratching sound grew louder, and when he turned toward his car, he saw movement in the back seat. His heart pounded as he crept closer, his phone's flashlight trembling in his hand. The beam landed on the back window, revealing a pale, emaciated face pressed against the glass. Its eyes were wide and unblinking, its mouth a gaping black void. As Sam stared, frozen in terror, the figure tilted its head slowly, almost curiously, as if studying him. Without thinking, Sam yanked open the car door and reached for the keys, but the face was gone. The back seat was empty. Breathing heavily, he slid into the driver's seat and jammed the key into the ignition. The car sputtered but didn't start. The scratching was back, now coming from underneath the car. It was louder, more frantic. Sam locked the doors, his fingers fumbling for his phone to call for help. The signal was gone. Then the car began to shake. It started as a faint tremor, but grew into a violent rocking. The windshield fogged over, and for a moment, everything went silent. The stillness was worse than the noise. A low, guttural whisper broke the silence, emanating from everywhere and nowhere. "You shouldn't have used the pump," Sam screamed, pounding the steering wheel. The fog on the windshield began to clear, but instead of the gas station, he was staring into endless darkness. Shapes moved within it, writhing and twisting, their forms too fragmented to comprehend. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices speaking in a language that made his ears ache. The last thing Sam saw was the pale face appearing inches from his own, its black mouth splitting open into an impossible grin. When the station opened the next morning, the third pump was clean, the ground beneath it dry and pristine. Sam's car was parked by the woods, empty. The cashier sighed as he flipped the open sign on. Another warning ignored, another traveler gone. The third pump remained, waiting for the next desperate soul to ignore the sign.
Story number 6.
There's an old, crumbling bridge in the middle of the forest near Weatherby, a forgotten relic covered in moss and graffiti. Locals call it the Whispering Bridge. The name comes from the legend that if you walk across it after dark, you'll hear faint whispers following you, growing louder with every step. Some say they're the voices of the lost, while others insist it's the bridge itself calling you to join them. Most people stay far away, but there's always someone who thinks it's just a ghost story. Claire was one of those people. She had heard the tales as a child and dismissed them as nonsense. But as a college student studying folklore, she saw the bridge as an opportunity to debunk a myth and maybe write a killer paper about it. Armed with her camera, a notebook, and a flashlight, Claire ventured into the forest just before midnight. The woods were unnaturally quiet as she approached the bridge. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The bridge was just as decrepit as she remembered, rotting wood planks, rusting railings, and a thick fog clinging to its surface like a living thing. Claire hesitated for only a moment before stepping onto the first plank. Her footsteps echoed hollowly, the sound swallowed by the fog. She walked slowly, her flashlight sweeping the bridge. She was halfway across when she heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. At first, it was so soft she thought it was the wind, but as she continued, it grew louder, forming words she couldn't quite make out. Claire stopped, her heart pounding. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The whispers stopped. Then a new sound, a creak, like a heavy weight shifting on the old wood. Claire spun around, but the fog was so thick she couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. Her flashlight flickered. "Great," she muttered, tapping it. The light steadied, but the whispers returned, louder this time. They weren't just around her, they were inside her head. Words in a language she didn't understand, overlapping and jumbled, yet filled with malice. Claire's breath quickened as she began to walk faster, her footsteps a frantic rhythm against the creaking planks. The whispers followed, growing sharper, angrier. She broke into a run, the old wood groaning under her weight. And then she felt it, a hand brushing her shoulder. She screamed, spinning around, but no one was there. The fog had thickened, swirling like smoke. Shapes moved within it, shadowy figures just out of reach, their forms shifting and melting like ink in water. The whispers became a deafening roar. "You don't belong here," a voice growled, low and guttural, cutting through the chaos. Claire stumbled backward, her foot slipping between two rotting planks. She fell hard, the flashlight clattering to the ground and rolling into the fog. Her ankle throbbed, and as she struggled to free herself, she felt the bridge tremble. Something was coming. She could feel it, heavy, deliberate footsteps vibrating through the wood. The shadows in the fog solidified, forming a figure tall and gaunt, its face obscured but its eyes burning like coals. It reached for her, its fingers impossibly long, its nails blackened and jagged. "No!" Claire screamed, wrenching her foot free and crawling backward. The figure moved closer, its head tilting as if studying her. Desperate, Claire scrambled to her feet and ran, the pain in her ankle forgotten. She didn't dare look back, even as the whispers turned into screams, filling her ears with their terrible, guttural cries. She burst off the bridge, collapsing onto the forest floor. The screams stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of her ragged breathing. When she finally dared to look back, the bridge was shrouded in silence and fog, as if nothing had happened. Claire didn't tell anyone what she experienced, but she couldn't bring herself to delete the footage from her camera. The next day, she watched it, hoping to find proof of her ordeal. The video showed her walking across the bridge, pausing, then running in terror. But the strange thing was the audio. There were no whispers, no screams, just her own repeating one phrase over and over in a flat, lifeless tone. "Come back! Come back! Come back!" Claire hasn't been seen since the night she left to revisit the Whispering Bridge.
Story number 7.
There was a diner on the edge of town, one of those places that seemed stuck in time. The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting an eerie glow over the parking lot, and the smell of stale coffee and greasy burgers hung in the air. Most people who lived in the area avoided it, not because the food was bad, but because of the stories. They said the diner only appeared on certain nights, when the moon was hidden and the air was so still you could hear your own heartbeat. People who entered after midnight often didn't return, and those who did spoke of things they refused to explain. Jake, a long-haul trucker with a penchant for ghost stories, had heard the tales but didn't believe them. He'd been driving for hours and was too tired to care about urban legends. So, when he saw the glowing neon sign for Eddie's Diner, he pulled into the parking lot without a second thought. The place was almost empty, save for a waitress behind the counter and a man sitting in the far booth, his face hidden by shadows. Jake chose a stool at the counter and ordered a coffee and a slice of pie. The waitress didn't speak much. Her movements robotic, her face expressionless. The coffee was hot, the pie was sweet, and Jake started to relax. But then he noticed something odd. The clock on the wall above the counter wasn't moving. Its hands were stuck at 12:03. He checked his phone. The time was frozen there too. "Your clock's broken," he said, trying to lighten the mood. The waitress didn't respond. She just stared at him, her lips slightly parted as if she wanted to say something but couldn't. Uneasy, Jake turned to look at the man in the booth. He was gone. Jake could have sworn he hadn't heard anyone leave. The diner was so quiet that even the hum of the neon sign outside seemed deafening. Then the door jingled, and a woman walked in. She was soaking wet, her hair plastered to her face, her clothes dripping onto the tiled floor. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and fixed on Jake. She sat at the stool beside him without a word. "Rough night?" Jake asked nervously, trying to break the tension. She didn't respond. Her lips quivered as if she were holding back a scream. Jake glanced at the waitress, hoping for some kind of reaction, but she was gone too. The diner was empty except for him and the soaking woman. The clock ticked once. 12:04. Jake's heart pounded as the whispers began. Soft at first, like the rustling of leaves, but they grew louder, overlapping, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Words in a language he couldn't understand, voices that sounded like they were just behind him, breathing down his neck. He stood abruptly, knocking over his coffee. "What the hell is going on here?" he shouted. The woman turned to him slowly, her head jerking unnaturally, like a puppet on strings. Her eyes were black pits now, and her mouth stretched into a too-wide grin. "You shouldn't have stopped," she whispered, her voice echoing like a hollow wind. Jake bolted for the door, but the moment he stepped outside, he realized he wasn't in the parking lot anymore. The diner was surrounded by endless darkness, the ground beneath him shifting like it wasn't solid. The neon sign buzzed louder, the letters flickering wildly before spelling something new. "You can't leave." The whispers were deafening now, accompanied by the sound of footsteps, many footsteps, approaching from the darkness. Jake turned back toward the diner, but it was gone, replaced by a vast, empty void. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him was the waitress, the wet woman, and the shadowed man standing together, their empty eyes fixed on him, their mouths whispering in perfect unison. Jake's truck was found the next morning on the side of the highway, its engine still running. There was no sign of him, but on the passenger seat was a cold cup of coffee and a slice of untouched pie. The clock on the dashboard was frozen at 12:04.
Story number 8.
There's a small, desolate town called Grayfield, surrounded by miles of flat, barren land. The town is unremarkable, except for a peculiar building at its center, a dilapidated, abandoned theater known as the Grayfield Grand. The locals avoid it at all costs, warning travelers to stay away from the show. Lucy was a photographer drawn to eerie places, and the Grayfield Grand had all the hallmarks of a perfect subject. She arrived in town just as the sun was setting, her camera in tow, determined to capture the theater's decaying grandeur. The townsfolk watched her with grim faces but said nothing as she parked her car near the building. The theater loomed over her, its once ornate facade crumbling, its windows black and lifeless. A faded marquee above the entrance read, "Tonight's performance. Don't be late." The letters were crooked and rusted, yet they seemed freshly arranged. Lucy hesitated but pushed the doors open. They groaned on their hinges, revealing a vast lobby coated in dust. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something faintly metallic. Her footsteps echoed as she ventured deeper, her camera clicking with every step. She entered the main auditorium, her breath catching. Rows of tattered red seats faced a massive stage draped in moth-eaten curtains. A grand chandelier hung precariously above, its crystals coated in grime. But what struck her most was the silence, oppressive and absolute, as though the theater itself were holding its breath. Lucy began snapping pictures, moving closer to the stage. As she adjusted her lens, she noticed something strange. The seats weren't empty. Dark, indistinct shapes sat in the shadows, too still to be human. Her heart quickened, but when she lowered her camera, the seats were empty. The chandelier above creaked. A sudden sound broke the silence, a soft, slow clap from the darkness. Lucy spun around, her flashlight beam darting across the room. It landed on a figure sitting in the front row, a man in a tattered suit, his face pale and waxy, his eyes reflecting the light like a predator's. "Welcome," he said, his voice low and raspy. "You're just in time for the show." Lucy stumbled backward, but the man didn't move. The stage lights flickered on, bathing the room in a sickly yellow glow. The curtains drew back, revealing an empty stage, except for a single chair. The man gestured toward it. "Your seat is waiting." Lucy bolted for the exit, but the door she'd entered through was gone, replaced by a solid wall. Panic set in as she turned back toward the auditorium. The seats were now full, rows upon rows of shadowy figures, their heads all turned toward her. The man stood, his movements stiff and unnatural like a marionette. "You mustn't disappoint the audience," he said, his grin stretching too wide. The shadows began to move, their forms shifting and twisting as they rose from their seats. Lucy screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the theater's oppressive silence. She backed away, tripping over debris, until she found herself on the stage. The chair was behind her now, impossibly close. Hands, cold, skeletal hands, emerged from the darkness and shoved her into it. Straps snaked around her wrists and ankles, binding her in place. The man stepped onto the stage, his hollow eyes meeting hers. "The curtain always rises," he whispered. The chandelier above shattered, plunging the theater into darkness. Lucy's car was found the next morning, abandoned outside the Grayfield Grand. Her camera lay on the passenger seat, containing a single photograph. It showed the theater's stage, bathed in golden light. Lucy was seated in the chair, her face frozen in an expression of sheer terror. Behind her, the shadowy audience clapped in perfect unison. The theater remained standing, its marquee unchanged. Tonight's performance, don't be late.
Story number 9.
There's a dirt road that cuts through the dense woods outside a small mountain town. Locals call it the Echo Path, and they avoid it whenever they can. The legend says that if you walk the path alone at night, you'll hear someone following you. At first, it's just the sound of footsteps echoing your own, but if you stop, the steps don't. Emma was a skeptic. She'd grown up hearing the stories about the Echo Path, but dismissed them as tales meant to scare kids. One summer night, she decided to prove it was all nonsense. Armed with a flashlight and her phone, she set out alone, determined to walk the entire length of the path. The air was heavy with the scent of pine, and the woods were alive with the hum of cicadas and the occasional hoot of an owl. Emma walked confidently, the gravel crunching under her boots. She even laughed to herself, wondering why anyone would find the path scary. About 10 minutes in, the forest grew quieter. The sounds of the night faded, leaving only her footsteps and the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. She paused to take a sip of water, and that's when she heard it. A second pair of footsteps. Emma froze, her heart skipping a beat. She spun around, shining her flashlight into the darkness. Nothing. Just trees and shadows. She told herself it was her imagination and continued walking, but the footsteps didn't stop. They matched her pace perfectly, crunching on the gravel just a few steps behind her. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Is someone there?" Silence. The footsteps stopped. Emma laughed nervously, convincing herself it was an echo. She took another step. The sound came again. One step, right behind her. She started walking faster, her flashlight shaking in her hand. The footsteps sped up too. Emma broke into a run, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The footsteps chased her, louder now, pounding against the gravel like someone or something was right on her heels. She didn't dare look back. She stumbled to a stop when she saw it ahead of her. A figure standing in the middle of the path. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its head tilted to one side. The light from her flashlight barely touched it, as if the darkness around it were alive. The figure moved closer, and Emma realized its face wasn't right. It was blank, smooth, as if someone had erased its features. She screamed and turned to run the other way, but the path behind her was no longer empty. Dozens of figures emerged from the shadows, their blank faces all tilted at the same unsettling angle. They didn't walk. They glided, silent now, as if the sound of their pursuit was no longer necessary. Emma backed away, her flashlight flickering. The circle of figures tightened around her, their heads tilting further, almost to the point of snapping. The last thing she heard before the flashlight went out was the crunch of gravel beneath her feet. The next morning, hikers found Emma's phone on the echo path. It was still recording, capturing her terrified breathing and frantic footsteps. Near the end of the recording, there was a sound, a whisper. Faint but clear. Keep walking. Emma was never seen again, and the echo path remains as silent and sinister as ever, waiting for its next traveler.
Story number 10.
There's a mirror shop at the edge of the city, tucked between two crumbling brick buildings. Its windows are dusty, and the sign above the door reads "Reflections" in faded gold letters. It's the kind of place you'd walk past without a second glance. But those who've been inside tell strange stories about mirrors that don't reflect what they should, about movements that happen a second too late, and about things lurking just out of sight. Derek was a collector of oddities. When he heard about Reflections, he couldn't resist. The shop had no website or phone number, just an address, so one dreary afternoon he decided to check it out. The bell above the door chimed as he stepped inside, and the air immediately felt heavier, thick with a metallic tang. The shop was cluttered with mirrors of every shape and size. Antique hand mirrors, full-length frames, ornate gilded pieces. The owner, an older woman with piercing gray eyes, appeared from the back. Her movements were slow and deliberate, her voice low and measured. "Looking for something special?" she asked. Derek nodded, explaining his interest in unusual items. The woman smiled faintly and gestured toward the back of the store. "I have something. Unique. But it's not for everyone." Intrigued, Derek followed her. She led him to a tall, rectangular mirror with a black frame. It was pristine, almost unnaturally so, as if it hadn't aged a day since its creation. There were no scuffs or marks, no dust on the surface. "This mirror," she said, "is not ordinary. It reflects more than what you see. It shows the truth, what's hidden, what's waiting. But it comes with a warning. Once you look into it, you can't unsee what it reveals." Derek, skeptical but intrigued, laughed. "I'll take it." The woman's expression didn't change. "You must be sure. Once it's yours forever." Derek dismissed her theatrics, paid in cash, and arranged for the mirror to be delivered to his apartment. That night, he hung the mirror in his living room. It was stunning, almost mesmerizing, and it seemed to make the entire space feel larger. He admired it for a moment before going about his evening, but as the hours passed, he started to notice small, unsettling things. At first, it was subtle, a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye, shadows that didn't belong. He convinced himself it was his imagination. Then, as he passed the mirror on his way to bed, he saw it clearly. His reflection didn't move. Derek froze, staring at the image of himself standing perfectly still, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. His reflection raised a hand and waved. He stumbled back, his heart racing. The mirror was just glass again, his reflection perfectly normal. Laughing nervously, he told himself he was overtired and went to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. Throughout the night, he heard faint whispers, too low to make out the words. When he finally drifted off, he dreamed of endless corridors filled with mirrors, each one reflecting not him, but shadowy figures with hollow eyes. The next morning, Derek avoided the mirror. He told himself it was just a trick of his mind, but the unease lingered. That night, as he sat on his couch, he felt compelled to look again. The mirror showed his living room, but something was off. The lighting was dimmer, and the air seemed thick with shadows. His reflection sat on the couch, staring back at him with a wide, unnatural grin. And then the reflection stood up. Derek remained frozen as his mirrored double moved closer to the glass, its grin stretching wider. It placed a hand against the surface, and Derek swore he saw the mirror ripple like water. The whispers grew louder, filling the room. Derek tried to move, to look away, but he couldn't. His reflection leaned closer, its mouth forming words he couldn't hear. Then it reached through the glass. The last thing Derek saw was his own hand pulling him into the mirror, the glass closing around him like water solidifying into ice. The next day, the mirror was gone from Derek's apartment. His neighbors reported hearing strange noises the night before, but no one saw him leave. At Reflections, the shopkeeper carefully wiped the black-framed mirror clean and placed it back on display. The surface shimmered, and for a brief moment, Derek's terrified face appeared, his hands pressed against the glass. Another customer walked in, the bell chiming softly. The shopkeeper smiled. Looking for something special?